Renson's beekeeping method is based on limiting brood rearing during the honey harvesting season to a brood chamber with 30,000 cells. In 1976, Renson stated that the less brood there is for bees to care for, the longer their lifespan. Renson was a Belgian beekeeper who kept 100 stationary hives. When he began to use this method, he expanded his apiaries to 400 hives and applied this technique across all his stationary sites. What is the fundamental principle of this method? With less brood to care for, bees live significantly longer. Normally, the less time bees spend nurturing brood, the less they wear out, and therefore, their lifespan is much longer than that of bees tending to a large amount of brood. Experiments with color-marked bees showed that when Renson's method was applied, bees lived from 80 to 85 days. With this method, around 25,000 forager bees are available during the honey harvest. The brood receives better care because there is less of it. Swarming is prevented. And most importantly, more honey is collected even though there are fewer bees in the colony. This method is suitable for all stackable hives. Preparation for the Renson method begins like any preparation for the first main nectar flow, which means properly winterizing the previous year by securing large reserves of honey and establishing strong colonies for wintering. The first operation should be done after the cleansing flight, which is usually at the beginning of February. All brood frames are then repacked into the brood chamber, which should be at the top of the hive. The only open entrance should be at the bottom board, with all other entrances completely closed. The brood should be placed in the upper chamber of the hive, where the microclimate, temperature, humidity, and other conditions are optimal for early colony development. Take care when arranging combs with pollen. The pollen reserves should form a ring above the brood so that the pollen or bee bread is within easy reach of the nurse bees, allowing them to use it easily to nurture as much brood as possible. Below this brood chamber, place surplus honeycombs directly below the brood itself. Scratch the honey on 2 combs in the center. This practically serves as an automatic feeding system. The bees will move this scratched honey upwards, creating the sense of an early nectar flow and encouraging the queen to lay more eggs. If you have a dadant hive, you cannot do this directly, so you will need to use a ring in which you place a comb with scratched honey above the brood chamber to achieve the same effect as 2 scratched honeycombs be below the brood chamber. After 7 to 10 days, scratch 1 honeycomb on each side of the brood. This stimulates the queen to lay as many eggs as possible. Every 10 days or so, place a scratched honeycomb in the lower chamber, moving empty comb up next to the brood. This stimulates spring development, speeds up colony growth, and helps create a strong colony for the first main nectar flow, which in our area is the acacia. If there is not enough honey, apply any method of stimulative feeding, whether it's a sugar cake, a thin syrup, 2 parts sugar to 3 parts water, every 3 to 4 days in early spring, or even better, 3/10 of a liter every evening. It doesn't matter, as long as it stimulates the colony's early spring development. What else is very important? In February, insulate the hive, especially above the brood. Insulation during winter isn't crucial until the real brood rearing begins. Once brood rearing starts, the main heat losses are above it, and it's necessary to insulate the hive well from above. The main period of spring development, from the blossoming of the blackthorn to the blooming of the apple tree, provides strong colonies for the first main nectar flow, and during this time, development should be maximized as much as possible. When a colony has at least 1 chamber full of bees and brood on at least 6 combs, it's time to swap the positions of the chambers. Place the upper brood chamber at the base and move the lower, mostly empty chamber, or one with very little honey, to the top. What does this accomplish? It effectively takes the first step against swarming while also encouraging the queen to continue laying in the upper chamber, avoiding brood chamber blockage from excess honey or pollen. By mid-April, following these measures, the colony should have brood in both lower chambers by the time the apple tree starts blooming. If there is no brood in both chambers, strengthen the hives designated for Renson's method, those meant to be honey producers with brood combs taken from weaker hives that are set aside for the first nectar flow. And when the apple tree blooms, it's time to set up for Renson's beekeeping method. What's the first step if you use a Langstroth or Farrar hive? Place a queen excluder between the brood chambers, and after 4 to 5 days, determine which chamber the queen is in based on where the eggs are laid. It's much easier to find the queen in just one chamber than to search in both. This way, wherever the eggs are, you know the queen is there too. Remove that chamber and set it aside, waiting about 10 minutes for the forager bees to leave and return to their original hive. This leaves only a smaller number of young bees in the removed chamber, which are not as aggressive as the foragers. You'll be able to inspect it more easily and find the queen more easily, especially if she is marked. Now, all that's left is to prepare the Renson chamber. What is the Renson chamber? The Renson chamber is any hive box that you beekeep with, set between two queen excluders. Vertical dividers, typically made from thin metal, limit the number of combs in the chamber, allowing between 28,000 and 30,000 cells in the combs within the center of the chamber. Excess combs are placed to the left and right of the dividers. For a Langstroth LR hive, there are 4 combs plus 1 drone comb between the dividers. For a Dadant DB hive, use 3 combs plus 1 drone comb. If using DB half boxes, you would have 7 half combs and 1 drone comb. With Farrar hives, use 6 combs plus 1 drone comb. This is how it looks. Pack the hive according to the Renson method. Once the apple blossoms appear, place a box with open brood and honey at the bottom. Then, place a queen excluder above it, followed by the Renson chamber. In the center of the Renson chamber, between the metal dividers, place 1 comb with brood and the queen on it. Fill the remaining space with frames of foundation, and add a drone comb next to one of the dividers to slow down the queen's egg laying. The empty space on the left and right should be filled with drawn comb frames. Place a second queen excluder over the Renson chamber, then add a box with sealed brood above it. It's essential that the hive has only 1 entrance at the bottom board. After 10 days of setting up the hive with the Renson method, check all brood chambers for queen cells. Not every colony will start queen cells, but some may produce emergency queen cells on open brood because the queen will be separated from both the upper and lower brood chambers. Also inspect the Renson chamber for any queen cells, and then repeat this check every 10 days. You no longer need to check the box on the bottom board or the box above the Renson chamber, as there will no longer be open brood in these, so queen cells won't develop there. If you find queen cells during the first inspection, remove them as usual. After the second inspection, remove any remaining queen cells. However, if the colony continues to produce queen cells after 2 removals, it may be difficult to prevent swarming, so you will either need to split the colony after the 3rd removal, or after the 3rd removal, remove the old queen and introduce a mated young queen after 5 days. This approach prevents swarming. You can choose to split the colony or remove the old queen and introduce a new one after 5 days, which is the better option as it keeps the colony strong and fully operational. During these 10-day inspections, cut out the drone comb and release any drones in the Renson chamber. Drones cannot pass through the 2 queen excluders. So if you don't open the Renson chamber every 10 days to let them out, they can become trapped in the excluder and die there. When the acacia blooms, what's our task? First, we add the honey supers, Why? In late April, the Renson chamber has only about 3/8 of young nurse bees. This is because the brood below has mostly closed, and the brood above has largely emerged. There is little open brood, as the bees needed time to draw out the foundation frames in the Renson chamber, and the queen has only just begun to lay in them. So there isn't a large quantity of open brood. About 5/8 of the young bees will strengthen the worker and forager forces, and all these bees will generally live much longer. There is no crowding of bees in the brood chamber. Why? The house bees are up in the honey supers, while the foragers stay in the lower box on the bottom board under the queen excluder, and the Renson chamber, which is the new brood chamber, has very few bees, thus reducing the impulse for swarming. An additional advantage is that excess pollen remains in the lower box, while all honey is practically stored in the supers above. Frames with pollen and honey are completely separated. Once the first super is filled with honey, at least 7 frames, place a second super beneath it, then a third, as with any other type of beekeeping. When moving to the next acacia location, you do so in the exact same configuration without any intervention. Harvesting the acacia honey, places skateboards above the second queen excluder, and the bees will quickly vacate the honey supers. On the bottom board, you have the lower box with pollen and the Renson chamber, which provides enough space for all bees while freeing the supers for honey extraction. When removing acacia honey and extracting honey, be cautious to leave enough food for the bees. Why is this important? In the Renson chamber, there is typically very little honey stored. Most frames are practically filled end to end with brood, and the lower box on the bottom board contains mostly pollen. Be mindful that the bees don't go hungry at this time, especially if there isn't sufficient natural forage available. Leave at least 2 to 3 combs with open honey if you're using hives with identical frame sizes in both the brood and honey supers. If you're using dadant hives with the Renson chamber and supers as half frames, then it's recommended to immediately feed the colony with several liters of thin syrup, which is 2 parts sugar to 3 parts water. This helps bridge the gap after honey extraction, preventing a slowdown in colony development or starvation. In the second half of June, it's time to stop using the Renson chamber and return Renson colonies to a regular colony configuration. Do this by locating the queen in the Renson chamber and moving her down below the queen excluder into the lower brood box on the bottom board. This box should have ample pollen and many empty cells for laying, encouraging the queen to resume egg laying there. The Renson chamber remains above the queen excluder with the brood inside, and after 7 days, place the Renson chamber with brood on a new bottom board and move it to a new location, effectively creating a swarm. By removing all closed brood from this hive, you also remove approximately 80% of the varroa mites, as most reside within the brood. The remaining 15 to 20% of varroa mites on the bees can be dealt with in a single treatment. Whether you use oxalic acid, formic acid, lactic acid, or thymol is up to you. But my recommendation is to apply oxalic acid by drip or sublimation. A single treatment will rid the colony of all varroa mites, effectively making it mite-free as it enters July. When removing the Renson chamber, it will primarily contain sealed brood with very little open brood just before capping. If there are any emergency queen cells, remove them and insert a new queen cell. This will essentially yield a new swarm. Make sure to feed this new swarm with thin syrup, as there are no foragers in the swarm. Provide at least 1 feeder of thin syrup to replenish food and water, particularly water. After this, add a pollen substitute patty and keep it in place as stimulative feeding throughout the season, helping the new queen to lay abundantly and allowing the swarm to strengthen into a full colony by autumn. After the new queen starts laying, and just before the brood is capped, Treat the swarm against mites with your preferred method around the 19th day after inserting the queen cell. By this time, there should be no sealed brood, and if there is any, it will be newly laid open brood with all varroa mites on the bees. One treatment will fully clear the varroa mites. Production colonies remain with 2 honey supers above the brood chamber, with or without a queen excluder, as you prefer. I don't use a queen excluder during sunflower forage, as there is no need. During sunflower forage, the bees compress themselves and settle into the brood chamber on the bottom board, so a queen excluder isn't necessary. Key timing considerations. Honey extraction usually occurs by mid to late July. That longevity we discussed, bees living 80 to 85 days, means that even bees laid before the queen was moved to the Renson chamber will still be alive, covering May, June, and July. This ensures that the colony strength is sufficient to last through the end of July or until sunflower forage concludes. By the end of sunflower forage, there will be a decrease in bee numbers. When you move the queen to the lower box at the end of June, the newly laid brood will begin emerging in mid-July, which may cause a temporary decline in colony strength. However, don't worry. The bees are free of varroa mites. The young brood is robust and well-nourished, and there is abundant pollen stored in the lower box on the bottom board. The colony will quickly grow back and will be thriving by August. At the beginning of August, after returning from forage and removing excess honey for extraction, leave each colony with at least 6 combs of honey and pollen, ideally 4 combs of honey and 2 combs of pollen. Place the honey supers with extracted combs on the bottom board, and on top of them, add the brood chamber without a queen excluder. Also, provide at least 2 kilograms of yeast patty using the classic yeast patty recipe, which you can find in my previous lectures on YouTube. Why add a yeast patty? During the 15-day period after sunflower honey extraction, the queen needs stimulation to increase egg laying. The yeast patty serves as a substitute, so you won't have to stimulate feed with syrup frequently. With 6 combs of honey and pollen and the addition of the yeast patty, the colony will have ideal conditions for the queen to continue vigorous egg laying until mid-August. Then, treat against varroa, but only if necessary. Don't treat against varroa mites automatically. First, check infestation levels by counting fallen mites on grease paper below a screen bottom board, or by dusting 300 bees with powdered sugar, or by using carbon dioxide fumigation, or by washing with alcohol, based on your preference. But always check first, and if mites are present, treat. The Ranson method generally ensures that at this time, in early August, there is no severe varroa infestation. Mites may only become problematic around the start of September. However, for extra precaution, check, and if mites are present, treat. If not, you can postpone treatment until early September. Why is this important? Each varroa treatment causes the queen to slow down egg laying. This slowdown in early August can cause colonies to enter winter slightly weaker. By delaying treatment, if infestation is low, you allow for a large number of healthy winter bees free of varroa damage due to low mite levels. Mid-August, conduct a hive check. Inspect the hive, check for sealed brood cells, and examine if they're sunken or perforated. Poke suspicious cells with a matchstick, and ensure there is no ropey content that might indicate disease. If you suspect illness, cut out a sample of brood, send it to a veterinary lab for analysis, and proceed accordingly. Equalize colonies. If a colony is strong, don't change anything. For weaker colonies, add the Renson chamber with a young queen over newspaper on top of the weaker brood box. Don't search for the old queen. The colonies will merge, and the better queen will prevail. For queenless colonies, do the same unless there are laying workers. If laying workers are present, simply shake out the bees to disperse them. Don't waste effort trying to introduce a new queen or trying other solutions. The best approach is to shake out the colony away from the apiary. The bees will spread to other colonies and you'll only lose a single hive cover. From any extra Renson swarms created in late June, combine 2 or 3 based on strength into a full colony by merging them over newspaper. This will ensure a strong colony for overwintering. Colonies low on food. At this point, colonies should have at least 8 full combs of honey. If they don't have this amount, feed them a generous syrup mixture with 3 parts sugar to 2 parts water until stores are replenished. By mid-August or early September, food reserves should exceed 45 pounds. Advantages of this method. This method increases honey yield. Why? More foragers, fewer nurse bees dedicated to brood care, and reduced pollen consumption due to less brood in the hive. There's also an added pollen reserve at the end of the season, a gift for the winter bees. Since the queen lays fewer eggs in the Renson chamber, she's limited and won't lay at the same rate as in a normal hive, effectively extending her life. Saves time. Time savings is somewhat relative. After the initial inspection, you'll mainly monitor the Renson chamber. Inspections of this chamber are quick. Move it aside, let the foragers return, and inspect for queen cells. Generally, queen cells first appear on the drone comb, which the bees build on fresh comb. Often, checking this single comb is sufficient to determine if queen cells are being created. Easier handling. The Renson chamber contains only young bees, which reduces the risk of stings. You won't need to inspect the lower box with the foragers and can simply lift the honey super to check if it's full. No swarming. The queen in the Renson chamber cannot leave the hive, so swarming is minimized. Even in rare cases where swarming does occur, the swarm will return as it has no queen outside the hive. Effective varroa control. This method also helps control varroa mites effortlessly. One treatment at the end of June frees both the Renson swarms and main production colonies from varroa mites. Removing the Renson chambers interrupts brood cycles, reducing potential viral infections. A straightforward investment in colony health. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, my email is available, and I'm always ready to help. Wishing you a successful beekeeping season.